Hey, welcome back to Critical Thinking. We're going to be continuing on today with our investigation of the presumption fallacies, the informal fallacies of the category presumption. This is going to be our second session dealing with the fallacies. So let's go ahead and dive in and pick up where we left off last time. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to be studying this session. We'll be working on the informal fallacies, the third group, remember the fallacies of presumption, and let's start with the category known as oversimplification, part 2, oversimplification. So what we have in this session are going to be 5 fallacies, and these are the fallacies. Again, I'm not going to read the names because we're going to be going through each of them one at a time, starting in just a second. So first, let's take a look at what we mean by oversimplification or reduction. Reduction is making a complex issue look simpler than it actually is. It's by focusing on some kind of limited aspect of something. Now, the first form of this, we're going to call it the fallacy of false dichotomy, faulty dilemma, bifurcation, or the excluded middle. A false dichotomy is an attempt to oversimplify a situation by reducing possible options. It's also called the faulty dilemma. And if you've studied dilemma, which we will do later on, I can give you a little bit of an idea how those work structurally. The argument is generally constructed of 2 choices as the only choices. This is a version of a formal disjunctive syllogism. Either P is true or Q is true. Well, P is not true, therefore Q must be true. Now, while the argument might be formally valid, an informal fallacy occurs if the disjunctive premise, that starting premise, the either or premise, is false, such as if there were other options. It might be like going between the horns of a dilemma. Sometimes you're presented with 2 options, but if you could find that third option, you're able to get out of the dilemma. So it's a false dilemma, a false dichotomy. The false dichotomy need not present an either or dilemma with only 2 options. You could actually have any number of options as long as the number of options presented falls short of the actual possible options out there. You might even say or present a false dichotomy by arguing that 2 options are contradictory, that they both can't be true, when in fact they might only appear to be contradictory. That's a type of stacking the deck. If we're going to schematize it or illustrate, it might look like this. We have option A, we have option B, which are going to lead to a conclusion. If it's not A, then it has to be B, when in fact there are other possibilities that you just don't see. Here's a great little video clip that I think illustrates this in a humorous way. It's actually 2 little video clips, so let's take a look at this one.
If you ain't first, you're last. You know what I'm talking about? That phrase is trademark, not to be used outside the tradition of Ricky Bobby. I did just like you told me. So if you ain't first, you're last. What the hell are you talking about? Well, you told me that day at school for career day. You came in, you said, if you ain't first, you're last. Oh, hell, Ricky, I was high when I said that. But that doesn't make any sense at all. You're first, you're last. You can be second, you can be third, fourth. Hell, you can even be fifth.
So here, even his father could see that it's a faulty dilemma. But let's take a look at some other examples of the false dichotomy. Either he's a theist or an atheist, and I know he's not a theist, therefore, draw your own conclusion. You can vote for Biden or Trump. You said you would never vote for Trump, so you must be voting for Biden, ignoring the fact that there's the option of not voting or third-party candidates, etc. If we don't vote Democrat, the poor will starve. If we don't vote Republican, we'll lose the war on terror. Either evolution is true or creation is true. Either you do your homework or you won't get into college. All of these are setting up the worst possible scenario. Well, not necessarily the worst possible scenario, but they're merely presenting 2 options, and there may clearly be other options. The next fallacy is sometimes called nothing buttery. It's kind of a humorous way to name this thing. It could be called the reductive fallacy or just oversimplification if you want to use the large subcategory title. And this happens when only one aspect of a thing is made out to be the entire or total situation. It argues that something is nothing but some narrow aspect of it. And often nothing but statements imply some type of more than knowledge. The argument is fallacious when the thing or situation is actually more complex than the way it's presented. So we could say we're going to present this thing here as the whole situation, when in fact there's more to it that we're not showing. Now, let's take some examples of the nothing but fallacy. Man is only an animal. Now clearly man is an animal. We're We're not saying that he's not, but that's just one aspect of man. To distinguish man from other animals, you've got to point out something that is going to set man apart from other animals. And when we do that, we're usually trying to point out certain distinct qualities where we can define our terms a little bit more carefully. Qualities that man has that animals lack. Or, a painting is nothing but color applied to a canvas. Thoughts are nothing but electric impulses occurring in the brain, which prompt us to act in certain ways. So humans cannot be accountable for what their material composition determines they do. This is a view that's known as behaviorism. Since humans are merely material, we do not have immaterial souls, or taxation is theft. It's taking what does not belong to you. Our next fallacy is going to be called the category mistake. And a category mistake is a fallacy based on confusion of kinds, types, and natures. When the principle of one category is imposed on something that belongs to a different category where those principles actually don't apply, that's where we fall into this fallacy. It's an attempt to draw conclusions on the basis of a comparison or combination of two ideas in different categories. It's like saying an apples to oranges comparison. The category mistake might involve confusing disciplines of inquiry and their methodology, such as confusing things like history and math, or philosophy versus natural science. These things have their own methodologies. They have their own way of operating. The methodology of the historian is different from that used by the biologist, or the mathematician, or the philosopher. So the category mistake can also occur when we confuse roles and relationships, like between authorities and citizens, or commanders and soldiers, parents and children, prescriptions and descriptions. Let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of category mistakes. God commands people not to murder, and then he kills people all throughout the Bible. The Judeo-Christian God is hypocritical. How does matter take up space? Even though that's a question, the problem here is with the type of question that it is. It's a how question. And how questions assume that there's some kind of process involved, when there doesn't seem to be any reason to assume a process when we're talking about space and matter. This world is filled with evil and suffering. It would have been better if there were no world at all. The question, of course, is how do we compare nothing with something, specifically in ethical terms? A non-existent world might be amoral, which is not morally better than a world that includes moral and immoral qualities. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Or, prove to me mathematically that there was a civil war. Again, historians don't use math to do their historiography. The teacher tells us to be quiet, but he's talking. What a hypocrite. I love this one. What color is a square? If it's okay for the government to imprison criminals, why can't I lock up this thief in my garage for a few days? Donald Trump is a successful businessman, so he would be a great president. Or what happened in the moments before time began? Here the category of prior does not apply to the category of first. There cannot be a before without a concept of time, nor can there be moments before a concept of time. And finally, one of my favorite ones, what does red smell like? Right? Red is not the type of thing that you sense with smell. It's something that you sense with your vision. And you can see that it makes no sense, but it's clear. It's a good example because it's clear. It's clear that we're confusing things that don't belong together. Okay, our next fallacy is the argument from the beard, which has many other names, which I've included on the screen, such as the heap fallacy, heap paradox fallacy, the bald man fallacy, continuum fallacy, line drawing fallacy, Sorites fallacy. I think there's more than enough names for it, but let's just stick with it as the argument from the beard. Now, the argument from the beard deals with issues of degree. The name comes from the idea that it's difficult to determine when somebody's facial hair is actually considered a beard. Does a few days of not shaving actually count as a beard? We know what clean shaven is, and we know what a full beard is, and they're at opposite ends of what we might call a continuum. We're unable to identify the precise moment at which the transition occurs, right, between facial hair being called or considered a beard in the full-fledged sense. That's the whole idea of this particular paradox or argument. So the fallacy occurs when you argue that you should not make a distinction between opposite ends of a continuum if you can't identify the precise moment at which the change occurs. It makes a comparison between a view one holds and a view that one correctly rejects. The argument is reject or accept X because it only differs in degree from Y, which you already reject or accept. And if we want to look at it in some type of structure, you could say the argument has this particular form. X is one extreme, Y is another extreme. There's no definable point where X becomes Y, therefore there is no difference between X and Y. The assumption is that by adding up small differences, you never end up with a big difference. 1 differs from 1 million on a continuum of potentially minute and insignificant changes. But is 1 the same as 1 million? Obviously not, or I'd be a millionaire. The fallacy blurs distinctions and argues that blurred distinctions equal no distinctions. The qualification that I have to put in here is the larger the spread, the more fallacious the argument, and the smaller the spread, the less fallacious it is. So let's take a look at some examples of the argument from the Beard. Since everyone is more or less good and bad, no one should call Stalin evil and Mother Teresa good. The distinction that's lost is since there's no absolute goodness in people, then you're told to reject any kind of relative goodness. Since the continual consumption of fast food causes some people to become obese, and obesity leads to shorter lifespans, then we should outlaw fast food altogether. Since we cannot calculate what speed would be the best and safest to travel within the city limits, we shouldn't even have a speed limit. The number's arbitrary. It isn't based on anything but opinion. Why does the law state that you have to be 21 to drink? Does it really make any difference if you're 20 years and 364 days old? That's absurd. Therefore, if a single day makes no difference, then a collection of single days, say 1,095, won't make a difference. So reverting the drinking age to 18 won't make a difference. Lex says, I just realized that I'll probably never go bald. Clark says, why is that? Well, if I lose just one hair, I won't be bald, right? Right. If I lose 2 hairs? Probably not. Lex says, well, every time I lose a hair, the loss of that one hair won't make me bald, so I'll never go bald. Congratulations, you just found the cure to baldness. Stupidity. All right. Fallacy of moderation up next. The arguer here assumes that the answer is always found in some mean between the extremes. It's really the opposite of the false dilemma. The opposite also of the argument from the Beard. The correct conclusion always depends on the specific premises. If you want the proper solution to the relevant situations, well, sometimes moderation is correct or preferable. At other times, the extremes might be correct. It depends what we're talking about. Truth, unlike virtue, is not determined by occupying some middle ground or constituting a compromise between two opposing positions. Now, I know we haven't talked about moral philosophy and virtue, but Aristotle defined virtue as a mean between different extremes that he would call vices. Truth is nothing like that. Now, this is psychologically moving in that it makes people feel comfortable. Non-confrontational people, for instance, gravitate towards this fallacy to appease both sides in an argument and simply end conflict. Keep the peace, prevent division. But truth doesn't care about appeasement. Let's take a look at some examples of this. Muslims and Christians both believe they're right about religion, and they're both worshiping the same God, so they should focus on the common ground and forget about their differences. Probably depends on what we're talking about specifically. John doesn't want to go to school at all. His parents want him to go every day, so the compromise has to be that he'll go every other day. Bruce wants Damien to try his first tandem skydive at a height of 4,000 feet. Damien doesn't want to go skydiving at all, so Bruce decides to push Damien from the plane at 2,000 feet, which is actually not recommended for a tandem skydive. Actually, taking the middle position here is worse than both other options. And that pretty much wraps up the fallacies that we're looking at this time. Next time, we're going to be moving on to unjustified assumptions, which will be our third session on presumption fallacies. And we have still several more to go. So again, stay tuned, and I hope to see you in the next video. Take care.